I think we'll get it cheaper anyway. Good morning. Let's take our song books, if you will, and turn to page 233. 233. Little is much when God is in it. Go ahead and stand when you find it, and we'll sing the first and the last verse. 233. In the harvest field now ripened, there's a work for all to do. Hark, the voice of God is calling, to the harvest calling you. Little is much when God is in it. Labor not for wealth or fame. There's a crown and you can win it if you'll go in Jesus' name. 233 on the fourth. When the conflict here is ended and our race on earth is run, He will say to all the faithful, welcome home, my child, well done. Little is much when God is in it. Labor not for wealth or fame. There's a crown and you can win it if you'll go in Jesus' name. Amen. You can be seated. And we're doing things a little bit differently this morning. Brother Josh is gone. And Jackson, if you can switch me over here. Brother Josh is gone, so I'm going to do the teen Sunday school class in here this morning. And you've got an outline. Hopefully, does anybody not have an outline? You should have one of these. Brother Kevin's got some extra ones. Did anybody not get one? Teens should already have theirs, hopefully, but... All right, I'm going to try to give you a crash course in this morning. All right. This is evolution and science, and there's a lot of things that we've been talking about. There's really this whole course is an apologetics course, and it's designed to help us to have confidence in the Bible. Does anybody know what apologetics is? If you could just put it in a simple sentence, what is apologetics?
How to tell someone else what you believe.
Yeah. A defense of the faith is essentially what it is, right? What I believe and why I believe that. That's what apologetics is. And so we've been going through this series in our class for quite some time now. We went all the way back and we looked at a lot of different archaeology. And all the archaeology points to the fact that the Bible is true. All of the places that are mentioned in the Bible, there's been many times when scholars, all the smart people have said, this place is mentioned in the Bible, but there's no evidence of it, and all of a sudden they find evidence of it. And even King David, for years and years and years, the archaeologists said there is no King David. There's no evidence of him anywhere. It's just a myth. It's just something that Israel made up to have somebody to follow, kind of like, Zeus or, some of these other mythical people. And then all of a sudden they started finding all kinds of things with David's name on it to prove that there was actually not only a King David, but that he was as powerful as the Bible says that he is, essentially, as a king. And many, many other things like that. But then evolution is also the same way. There's many things that evolution came along, and I don't have time to give you all of the history of it, but actually here's what we've been looking through when it comes to evolution and science. And of course I don't have it now. Is there a reason it's not following me here? Let me disconnect and try reconnecting again. Sorry, give me 1 second here. See if this does it. It's not. Well, let's see what happens here. Let me disconnect. I think I've had to do this a couple times before. Let me try this real fast. I'll reconnect. Sometimes I try to set it all up ahead of time, and sometimes when it sits there for a little bit, it doesn't connect. There we go. All right. So let me get to the slideshow. There we go. All right, so this is what we've been discussing in our class, and the history of evolution. Let me just give it to you very, very briefly, all right? Charles Darwin is credited with coming up with the theory of evolution. He did not come up with the theory of evolution. He popularized the theory of evolution. It's been around for many, many years, but when Charles Darwin went and visited the Canary Islands and some of the other islands out in that same general area, he observed some different things that he felt gave credibility to evolution. And so he came back and he wrote a book called On the Origin of Species, and that book became very, very popular. And really, during that entire time, you got to kind of understand what was going on in world history at that time. In the late 1800s and mid to late 1800s, Bible skepticism was very, very high. And much of that was coming out of Germany. There was a lot of higher critics in Germany. And during that time, a lot of Americans went over to study in Germany and came back with a strong criticism of the Bible. Doubting the stories in the Bible, doubting the miracles, doubting the deity of Christ, doubting many of these different things. And when evolution was reintroduced, if you will, or popularized during that time, it gave them some other way to explain how everything got here other than creation. And so many, many, many people jumped on this theory of evolution. It became very, very popular, but you've noticed that I've said theory of evolution because that's all it is, and that's all it ever has been. Nothing in evolution has ever been proven. They're still today looking for a missing link, something to prove that evolution is the way everything got here. And they have their proofs and different things like that, but slowly but surely, every one of those proofs gets disproven. And they, many times, even the evolutionists themselves, come to the conclusion that, okay, you're right, that's not a proof for evolution. But we have this. And then they stick with that one for a while, and it looks really good, and then all of a sudden, that one got disproven, and disproven too many times that even the evolutionists say, you're right, that one's not a good proof. But we have this, and they just continually keep moving to different ideas about how everything got here, about how evolution could be possible and everything else. Now, I will say this. I give Charles Darwin a little bit of a pass because back in the mid to late 1800s, they didn't have near the information that we have today. And even with what we're going to talk about today, the fossil record, even with the fossil record, Charles Darwin said, we don't have much information. Paleontology is in its infancy. We don't have much in the fossil record, but I can tell you that as more research is done, as paleontology grows, the field of paleontology grows, more fossils are found. I believe it's going to prove the theory of evolution. Well, that was 150 years ago. Now we have a lot of fossils, millions and millions of fossils that have been found. Much research has been done through paleontology, and nothing has proven evolution. And I'll give Charles Darwin a pass because he didn't have a lot of information, but I don't give the evolutionists today a pass because there is so much information out there. There's no way that evolution could possibly be true. And one of the greatest evidences against evolution is the fossil record. So I'm going to give you a crash course in this. We've actually been in this for about 3 or 4 weeks, maybe even 5 weeks by now, and we've covered a lot of different things in here. But I'm going to give you a crash course in the fossil record this morning. So you have your outlines there. Let's jump right into this. Number one, this is your little dot at the top. The fossil record is used to prove evolution, but it actually disproves evolution. That's the fossil record is one of the biggest evidences, if you want to call it that the evolutionists have. And, everything has turned out to be a hoax. We spent a lot of time talking about the ape men. The ape men that were, you've probably all seen the transition chart that goes from an ape to a human, right? I mean, that's kind of, when you see evolution, that's a lot of times what you picture. This little guy that started as an ape and slowly, gradually stood upright, and next thing you know, he's a man, right? They found all of these transitional forms, if you will, all of these ape men. But it turns out that every single one of them was either a hoax or misproven. They built an entire ape man out of a tooth that they found. They found a tooth, and based on that tooth, they built an entire man out of that thing. That was hairy, long arms like an ape. The digits that are all separated makes it easy for them to grab onto trees and everything else. We finally found proof based off of a tooth, and then they found out that it was actually a pig's tooth. They They found fossils that were buried in like an old limestone quarry. They found a leg bone, they found an arm bone, they found a few different things. They made this entire man, ape man, out of these bones that they found. And it turned out, when they started doing more research into it later on, that it was actually not even real bones. Somebody faked it, painted them to look old, and then buried them, and then he magically found it. You know, the thing is, when you find something that proves evolution like that, you get fame, you get money, you get popularity, you get all of those things. And so why would somebody not want to go find these evidences for evolution, right? I found a transitional form. Now you're speaking all over the world. Now you're writing books. Now everybody knows your name. So the temptation is very, very strong to fudge these things and to apply these hoaxes and to come up with all these different things that prove. Every one of them, when it comes to those ape men, has all of them have been proven to either be 100% ape or 100% human, or complete hoax. One of those three things has always been what has come. And even the evolutionists agree with that. It's not just that I'm a creationist and I'm saying it from my perspective. But this is the fossil record is where, of course, they find these things. Fossil record is just a little bit different than that, but we'll talk about that. So the fossil record, this is number 2, is vast. It is huge. There are millions and millions and millions of fossils that have been found over the course of all these different years. And I'll say this is your third point there. Charles Darwin knew that the fossil record did not provide evidence for his doctrine, but he believed this problem could be explained by the incompleteness of the record and the rudimentary state of paleontology in his day. I explained that already, but that's just a way for you to write that down. The incompleteness of the record is what he blamed for not having evidence of evolution. Now it's not incomplete. Now there are so many fossils. Now we know a lot from the fossil record. And so the fossil record has some problems, and for evolutionists, I will say. And today there are 200 million fossils in museums worldwide. And that doesn't even include all the fossils that people have found and kept for themselves. I mean, there's millions and millions and millions of fossils that have been found. And nothing that proves evolution. So here's some problems with the fossil record for evolution, which obviously are not problems for us. They help creation. They prove creation. So here you go. Number 1, the fossil record's geologic column has major problems. Major problems. Now, I will show you what the geologic column looks like, and I know you can't see it all from there, but you have the Paleozoic age, you have the Mesozoic age, and you have the Cenozoic age. Those are the three major ages that the fossil record or the geologic column is broken up into. And all the way at the bottom, the Precambrian layer. This layer is I can't see it myself, but it's 250 million years old. Some even more than that. But this fossil column consists of layers of the earth that supposedly represent millions of years of time. There's supposed to be 3 major eras, 13 stages. The Paleozoic, there we go, 540 to 250 million years ago is the oldest stage. That's where you have, of course, they said that everything started off as single-celled organisms and gradually got more and more complex until you ended up with, that organism crawling out of the primordial ooze. That got here by the Big Bang, by the way. There was a huge explosion, and all of this stuff just got here. Last time I checked, an explosion does not help things. It destroys it, right? Could you imagine if there was a giant explosion, and all of a sudden, the next thing you know, there was a giant jumbo jet that just magically assembled itself, right? And a jet, by the way, is far less complex than even one single human cell. There are still things, even with the technology that we have today, there are still things that they do not know about a single human cell, that they have not been able to figure out either how it works. They're still discovering things that are inside, the smallest of the things that are inside the cell. Inside every single cell, and you have trillions of them in your body. Inside every single cell, you have the equivalent of a gigantic factory operation going on in every single cell in your body. And they multiply by the thousands and even the millions daily. You lose cells, you gain cells. It's just so complex. And all of this happened by a massive explosion. But then the cell formed, and it got bigger and more complex, and next thing you know, it crawled out onto the land, and then that thing mutated and had something else. And, the problem with that is mutations are not usually good, right? That's why you don't see all kinds of mutations out here everywhere. Mutations don't normally live, right? One of the things that they say is that a bat came from a rat, okay? So think about some of these problems that you would have, okay? Bats can't see, right? They use echolocation, and they fly to catch their food, and they eat bugs and everything else. If a rat suddenly became a half bat, and now it's either blind or it has wings, but it can't grab its food because the mouse's body is far too heavy to fly, right? If by chance there was something that became a half mouse, half bat, it's not going to live a week, let alone millions of years to keep evolving, right? And that's the same thing that you see with every so-called transitional form. Those transitional forms can't live. They're mutations, right? A mutation does not usually survive. And if it does, it usually doesn't survive very long. And if it does not reproduce as that mutation. It can't, right? Because it's a mutation. And so the whole theory of evolution and everything getting here by mutations falls apart when you just think about it from a logical standpoint. You don't see things walking around with two heads, right? Or if you do, it's very, very rare, right? And they're not reproducing other things with two heads with every generation that comes after that, right? Because it's a mutation. And so what you end up happening with all of these things, the age of multi-celled organisms, the fish, the amphibians, and gradually they got more and more complex, and the next thing you know, now you have everything that we have today with all of the multi-celled organisms and all of those other things. And so I got to move along quickly or we're not going to get very far. But here, let me give you some major problems. I'm skipping all of these things here. This is problems with the geological column here. Some very difficult things that they run into. And the first is the problem of depth. According to evolution, every layer represents millions of years, okay? This is not any of your points here, all right? I'm going to give you some more of these, but this is just kind of setting the table for what I do want to talk to you about with this. But layers of millions of years of sediment that gradually laid down. So each layer would be millions of years thick. And if every layer was visible in one part of the earth. By the way, that's a huge problem for them because there is no geologic column that starts at the bottom and goes all the way to the top anywhere on earth. Nowhere on earth do we find that. But it would be 100 to 200 miles thick if it was. Could you imagine going 200 miles deep into the earth? There is no place on earth where the geologic column is visible because of that. So there's nowhere on earth that's seen. And we've got a lot of different things that go along with that. But here's their first problem, letter A. A major problem with that is the missing strata. The missing strata. Their unconformities are layers in which millions of years of supposed evolutionary history are missing. Right? You have places on earth where there are these strata, but you go from something that they say is 150 million years old, you skip layers and you go to something that is 50 million years old. And there's layers that are missing in between there. If it took millions and millions and millions of years to lay those things down, how are those layers missing? Where are they at? Right? Why are they not everywhere on earth? If it took millions and millions of years for that to happen, why don't we see them everywhere? It should be in every layer. Right? And they're just not. There are 14 major nonconformities just in the Grand Canyon. Layers that are missing in the Grand Canyon, 14 of those layers that they're just not there. If evolution is true, the billion years would be represented by deep layers of rock, but again, those layers are missing. Here is another major problem with the geologic column. This is letter B. The geologic column is often jumbled together. Sorry, this slide here. Problem is that the geologic column is often jumbled together. Sorry if I get this a little bit out of order or whatever. I'm skipping a lot of slides. I'm skipping through this very quickly because I want to try to get to as much of this as possible. But that's another problem. It's often jumbled together. And by that I mean this. They've identified how old these layers are. What you have is a layer that they say is 150 million years old that's buried in the layer above something or below something that they say is 250 million years old. Or you have a layer that's supposed to be 540 million years old because it's the oldest, it's the Precambrian layer, and you find that on top of other layers that are supposed to be younger than that. How is that possible? If they got laid down over millions of years, there should be no jumbling together. Everything, everywhere on the earth should always be in the exact same order, right? How do you explain to lay down? Here's another huge problem. Fossilized trees that pierced the geological column. The geological layers have fossilized trees in them. What happens when a tree dies? It rots, falls over, continues to rot, and it goes back to dirt, doesn't it? How long does that take? 100 years? Let's give it a lot of time and say that it took 100 years for that tree to die, for it to rot standing up, for it to fall over and go back to dust. Let's say it took 100 years for that to happen, right? These trees that they have found fossilized pierce layers that are millions of years old. It starts in layers that are, let's just say, 75 million years old and go up to layers that are 50 million years old. Is it possible at all for a tree to stand for 25 million years? No way possible, right? It's not going to live that long, number one, but even if it's dead, it's not going to stand for that whole time. But if evolution were true and everything was laid down over millions of years, then that tree stood there while all those millions of years accumulated to accumulate those layers, right? Well, how do you explain a tree standing up through multiple layers? It happened all at the same time, right? Through a worldwide flood. That's the only way that you can explain that it happened. In order for something to be fossilized, okay, what happens when you shoot a deer? And let's just say, obviously for the sake of this argument, you just shoot a deer, it dies, you don't clean it, you don't do anything. Okay, let's just skip the shooting. Let's say you find a deer on the side of the road, right? What happens to that deer? It rots. Let's say no vultures found it, it didn't eat, nothing ate it up, right? But that deer rots. And what happens to it? Eventually all the skin goes away, eventually all the meat goes away, and then you're left with bones, right? What happens to those bones? Eventually they deteriorate to the point where they're just like paper and they crumble. It takes a little bit of time, right? But that's what happens. That's why you don't walk through the woods and just see thousands of deer bones everywhere, right? Because, think about how many deer have died over the course of the last 250, 300 years that people have been on this continent, right? It doesn't happen because they all eventually disintegrate and they disappear, right? But how do you have then deer in the fossil record or fish or anything else in the fossil record? Something that is fossilized cannot be fossilized if it takes millions of years for those layers to build up around it, right? It's not going to fossilize that way. It would be gone long before it had time to do all of that stuff. But if something is buried very quickly in a mudslide or in a volcano or something like that, it's fossilized. It's frozen in place, just exactly like that. In the fossil record, they have found dinosaurs that are in the process of giving birth. They found dinosaurs that were sitting right on top of eggs that still had the embryo inside the egg. How does that happen over millions and millions of years? It can't. In order to be fossilized, it has to be buried very quickly. And that's exactly what you have happening with these trees. Fossilized trees that are piercing multiple layers of the geological column are not going to happen over millions of years. It's going to happen instantly. And that only gives us more proof that the biblical flood is true and that's the way that everything happened. So let me give you another one. Here we go. Skipping around. Number 4. Letter D. Another problem is the out-of-place fossils. Out-of-place fossils. It's another problem that you have. And when I say that, I mean this. A lot of fossils have been found in the wrong layers. So what they have is, all right, your dinosaurs and all of those other things where they were the ones that came along first. Or not even that. Your single-celled creatures, your really small things that everything else kind of grew out of. It would make sense that those were in the oldest layers, right? They would have to be, because they were the ones that died first. They got buried over multiple years, millions of years. They got buried first. Problem is, you find things that they say are supposed to be 250 million years old in the 50 million year old layers. And you have things that they say are 50 million years old that are buried in the 250 million year old layer. How is that possible? If it died and all of those lived down there, and then evolution happened and all of those things came from those things, then how are those fossils jumbled? Well, there's only one way to explain it. They were all buried at the same time. All at the same time and with a worldwide flood. All right, that's the only way that you can possibly explain that. Let me give you number 2. The fossil record, first of all, the geological column has major problems. Number 2, the fossil record does not contain the countless transitional creatures that Darwinian evolution requires. Okay? It would be one thing if there was thousands and thousands and thousands of these things. We could say, all right, somehow we have to explain this to be able to say that evolution is not true. Right? But here's the problem for evolutionists. Not only are there not thousands and thousands and thousands of transitional creatures, there are none. They have never found a transitional creature. There's been times when they thought they have. You know, there's a fish that lives way, way, way deep in the ocean that actually has feet. And they're like, oh, look at this. They found it in the fossil record first. And that was their evidence for evolution. Well, then they found out that actually somebody caught one. It was really deep in the ocean, but they caught it, brought it up. And now they find out that there's actually hundreds of them in the ocean. It's not evidence of evolution. It was something that stayed the same for their supposed millions of years, right? They found it in a million years old layer, but they're still alive today. So obviously either evolution did not happen, or it's still in the process of evolving, or that's just the way it was made, right? It's the way it was created, and obviously we know that that's the case. So the transitional forms that are supposed to be there are not. Letter A, Darwin admitted that the fossil record didn't contain these partly formed creatures. Darwin was at least a little bit honest. Now, Darwin does not get a pass because he was a Bible critic. He didn't believe the Bible, and that's why he came up with this theory in the first place. But at the same time, he was at least a lot more honest than a lot of the evolutionists are today. Darwin admitted that there was not a lot of evidence for his theory. Darwin admitted that they didn't know these different things. And Darwin even admitted that if someday they were able to disprove his theory, he would discard it. Now, he never did that by the end of his life. He didn't discard his theory, but at least he was honest enough to say this is a theory. The ones who are alive today that are promoting these ideas of evolution are not honest enough to say Darwin was right. There is no evidence for evolution. But Darwin at least admitted that there was not enough evidence to prove that there was transitional creatures found in the fossil record. But his idea was, hey, over the next however many years, as paleontology advances and as more fossils are found, we will find those transitional creatures. Well, it never happened. 175 years later, there are still no transitional creatures that have been found in the fossil record. That's a huge problem for evolutionists, because literally their entire theory is based on the fact that everything was a transitional creature at some point. And there's none. There's none. Let me give you another point here. Letter C. Evolutionists claim to have found missing links, but when they're examined, it's evident that they're not the kind of evidence that would stand up in court. If you were to take evolution and put it on trial, you would not find any of these transitional creatures. Evolutionists claim to have found missing links, but when they're examined, it's evident that they're not the kind of evidence that would stand up in court. Nobody would say that evolution is true if you were to present the evidence on both sides. Let me give you letter D, the fossil record. Sorry, jumping around here. Let me jump farther here. I'm skipping a lot. I wish I could give you all of this. But the fossil record disproves evolution, and that it does not contain the countless transitional creatures that Darwinian evolution requires. There just is not the evidence. So that's a huge problem for evolutionists, because the fossil record does not contain the countless creatures that Darwinian evolution requires. Here's another problem for evolutionists. Number 3, the fossil record shows creatures appearing suddenly, fully formed, with no evolutionary history. That's a big problem for evolutionists. First reason why is the suddenness. Let me jump up here. The suddenness, the Cambrian layer is kind of where this explosion took place, so to speak. But the suddenness of the appearance of creatures has even been given the name Cambrian explosion, or biology's Big Bang. The Cambrian layer is named after the rocks in Cambria, Wales. That layer is supposed to be 500 to 600 million years old, supposed to represent the beginning of life. It's very early at the beginning of the Paleozoic era, as we already mentioned and showed you. But they call it the Cambrian explosion because a huge variety of fossil creatures appear in these rock layers fully formed. In other words, you would think that there would be layers below it that would have all of these transitionary creatures in it. But that's not the case. This Cambrian explosion shows all of your animals all completely fully formed, zero transitional forms in that layer. So it's a huge problem for evolutionists because how did those get there? Where did they come from? If they came from evolutionary transitions, then there should be evolutionary transitions everywhere in those layers, but they're not. They appear suddenly. All of a sudden, in the layers that they claim to be the oldest, all of these animals appear fully formed, no transitional forms whatsoever. And again, that's a huge problem for them. That's a big problem for evolutionists. Here you go. Letter B. Darwinism predicts that the fossil record will show that creatures gradually evolve, but in fact, it shows creatures appearing fully formed. Missing from the fossil record are the millions of years of slow development from the supposed first simple life form below the Cambrian layer. So you have the Precambrian layer, and in that Precambrian layer, there should be all kinds of transitional forms. Because in the Cambrian layer, you have all of these animals fully formed. But here's the problem. There are no transitional forms in the Precambrian layer either. So how did they get there? Well, there's one way to explain that. And that is a worldwide flood. That's how they all got buried at the same time, very suddenly. Here's another problem with the fossil record for evolutionists. The fossil record shows complexity from its earliest layers. And we kind of discussed this already a little bit, but complexity from the earliest layers. Letter A, according to the Darwinian doctrine of evolution, life arose from a simple creature, one-celled, and developed into ever higher life forms, creatures such as bacterium to higher and higher life forms, but that's not what the fossil record shows. There is no single-celled creatures that gradually got bigger and bigger. There's none of that. There's no simple creatures in the fossil record. Everything just shows up. Letter B, creatures appear not only fully developed, but with incredibly complex features. Things like trilobites, and if you've ever been to the Creation Museum, they have a lot of different fossils in the Creation Museum. In fact, they even have some fossils in the Ark encounter. They have a very large leaf that's fossilized from a tree in the fossil record. Guess what? Leaves die. And in just the course of less than a year, they get hard and they get soft and brittle and they crumble. Right? A leaf can't lay there for millions of years while layers form over the top of it. No, it has to be buried all at once in order for that to happen. So the bat, here's a lot of different things. The oldest bats had the ability to fly and to detect insects with echolocation organs. They all had those in the fossil record. The trilobite, eyes, 15,000 lenses in some of the species of trilobites. That's not a simple single-celled creature. That's very complex. No such thing as a simple creature. Microbiology has taught us that. A bacterium is more complex than a modern city. Just one little cell. Even plant life. Plants, by the way, do math. Do you know that? Obviously, plants need sunlight to live because that's what they use for photosynthesis, right? What they've done is a bunch of different experiments to try to see how these plants do when you take them out of the sunlight and put them in a dark room. And what they found is that these plants will actually do complicated math problems, if you will, to figure out how to store the stuff that they already have so that they can stay alive while they don't have the sunlight. And then when you put them back out in the sun, they do these complex calculations again to figure out how to start this process all over. And there's just so much. There's so much that goes along with all of those things to just prove that there's not these simple little one-celled creatures. You don't find them anywhere in the fossil record. Letter C, the complexity of creatures at every level of the fossil record disproves evolution. Life appears in all of its amazing complexity from the very, very beginning. Here's number 5, problem with the fossil record for evolutionists. The fossil record exhibits stability or stasis. You've heard of homeostasis, same state. The stability of species rather than change. And that's a big problem for evolutionists as well. Here's letter A. Creatures not only appear in the fossil record fully formed, as we already talked about, but they also retain the same form and habits throughout their existence, even over supposed millions of years. There are bats in layers that are 150 million years old, and there are bats in layers that are supposedly 50 million years old that are the exact same. There's no change in the 100 million years between those bats. If evolution was constantly evolving, and creatures were constantly evolving through evolution, then there should be changes in 100 million years. The problem for evolutionists is there are no changes between the 150 million-year-old bats and the 50 million-year-old bats. There's no change at all. Now, obviously, we know that the earth and history that we have from the Bible doesn't give near that much time. 6,000 to maybe 7,000 years old is the oldest the earth could be, maybe 10,000 years old at the very, very oldest. Not millions of years. So we know it didn't happen over millions of years anyway. But even on top of that, it's a big problem for evolutionists because 100 million years and everything is supposed to be gradually changing, and there's no change in 100 million years between the creatures that are buried at those oldest layers and the creatures that are buried in the youngest layers. That's a problem for them. It's a huge problem for them because it just proves that everything has stayed the same, that the evolution, the change that evolution requires just didn't happen, especially the way that they said it did. So there's a lot of different quotes by a lot of different evolutionists even. This is one from Johns Hopkins University. He said, "I've demonstrated a biological stability for species of animals and plants that I think would have shocked Darwin. Something tends to prevent the wholesale restructuring of species." I wonder what that something could be. Maybe it's God, huh? Maybe the Bible is true after all. But this is a bat that's supposedly dated to 50 million years old. Looks very, very, very similar to a bat that you'd see today. If you saw a bat skeleton and saw what a bat skeleton looks like, it looks very, very, very similar to that bat. Because the problem is there have been no changes. Letter B, this proves that layers of sediment. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Letter B on the top. The stability of creatures disproves Darwinism. If evolution is true, living things would continue to change. All right, number 6. The uniformitarian view is now rejected even by evolutionists. Now, I've got to do this very, very quickly because Charles Lyell, Charles Darwin, Thomas Huxley, those were all men who were very popular during that time and helped popularize the idea of evolution. Thomas Huxley was called Charles Darwin's bulldog. He was called Darwin's bulldog because he was the one that was out there. Charles Darwin was not a very outspoken guy. He was not a guy that was out there doing all these speeches and championing evolution, although he wrote the book. Thomas Huxley, who was also a Bible critic, found Charles Darwin's book, and he became the champion for the cause of evolution. He was the one that was giving speeches and being very passionate about getting this idea of evolution out to the masses. And so he was one of them. And then Charles Lyell also was a student of Charles Darwin. And Charles Lyell came up with the idea of uniformitarianism. And uniformitarianism basically says that everything continues at the same rate as it always has. So you look at the river in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and you can tell that the river at the bottom of the Grand Canyon is carving itself deeper by 1 inch per year. So if we take that calculation, then we can see how deep the Grand Canyon is, and we can say that it took this many millions of years for the Grand Canyon to form. Okay? Even evolutionists reject that idea today because it's very, very, very easy to see that those things happen even today. Look at the floods that just happened in Texas, right? A small little river that gets a massive flood can carve a gigantic river in a matter of a couple hours or a day, let alone millions of years, right? Even through rock layers. There's been a lot of evidence of that, and I'll try to share some of this with you. I may have to do this next week. I want to finish this for you without just kind of leaving you hanging, but maybe we'll do this in Sunday school next week, because I'm pretty much out of time. I don't want to go too long, and I want to explain a little bit more of this for you. Brother Josh is going to be surprised to find out that he's not teaching Sunday school next week, but I just want to give you a little bit more in the way of this, because there's so much to this. But the fossil record is really the greatest evidence that we have against evolution and in favor of creation. Obviously, you look at the ape men, it's very easy to prove that they're not evolutionary, right? They're either ape, they're man, or they're fake, right? There's a lot of other things that prove evolution is not true and prove that creation is true. And I'm not just saying that give us evidence. I'm talking about that prove that evolution is not true, right? And like I'm saying with this, even the evolutionists agree that uniformitarianism, and this is one of their biggest arguments for years and years, uniformitarianism, look, everything's the same as it always has been. Even they reject this idea now. They've moved down from it because they're saying, you're right, there's no way that this proves evolution. They're still not saying creation is how everything got here, but they're willing to move the goalposts now, let's just say. And Charles Lyell, with this idea of uniformitarianism, the past is the key to the present, has been disproven so many times that even evolutionists, the majority, if not all of them, say, okay, you're right. Uniformitarianism is not true. We know that because we can see it. And you look at volcanoes that erupt and how they completely change the landscape in just a matter of hours. And it's enough to say that the past is not the key to the present. Right? So we'll discuss this next week. I'll finish this out. Maybe I'll slow down a little bit and give you the last of it a little bit slower, and give you a few more things that go along with that. But let's pray, and then we'll finish up for this morning. Father, again, we thank you so much for your goodness to us. We thank you for the opportunity that we have to just prove that the Word of God is not only reliable and true, but that we can stand on it. We can trust in it, everything that we find in it, not just these stories of creation and the flood and all of these other things, but every part of it is true. And we thank you for that. I pray that you would just help us to be stronger in our faith when it comes to these things, and to be able to give an answer to every man that asketh a reason of the hope that is found in us through Jesus Christ. And may this be a help to us as we go forward. Thank you again for all you do for us in Jesus' name. Amen.